In this episode, we are talking about why chopping up your long-form content into short-form video clips and posting them on social media is doing nothing to drive traffic back to your podcast. I'm going to walk you through 3 mental shifts that have to happen first if you want to be able to use your podcast content effectively to attract new listeners to your show from social media, and give you a 3-step strategy you can use when planning your episodes to help you do exactly that. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. So if you remember a few episodes back in episode 226, we talked about 2 types of traffic when it comes to growing your podcast. There's driving traffic to your podcast to increase your listens, increase your downloads, and increase your listener base over time. And then there's driving traffic from your podcast into your marketing and sales funnels, onto your email list, into your programs. So in episode 226, we zoomed in on the lower part of that funnel, driving traffic from your podcast onto your email list specifically. And in this episode, we're going to zoom out and look at the top part of that funnel, driving traffic from social media to your podcast specifically, and talk about why repurposing your podcast content, chopping it up and posting it everywhere on social media is the least effective way to drive traffic back to your podcast. Because chances are, I bet you started your podcast because you wanted one place where you could create that thought leadership content and then easily chop it up and distribute it across all platforms. We see tons of thought leaders doing this, and it's great in theory. But in reality, chances are you found that every time you share your podcast content specifically to social media, whether it's a video clip that a video editor you've hired has pulled for you, or you've used an AI tool to produce for you, or maybe you're sharing that audiogram to your Instagram stories, or heck, throwing the entire podcast video up on YouTube, hoping that it helps you reach new listeners, you have found that engagement on those posts is the worst of anything that you ever post. Like, you're lucky to get 500 views, maybe 1 to 2 comments, a like or 2. You never get any followers from it on any of those platforms. And what's worse is that you can't really tell if it's making any impact at all to your podcast downloads, because you have no way of knowing if those people who even saw that clip on Instagram or TikTok or wherever it was even click through to listen to the show. In fact, it's probably unlikely from the looks of your download numbers. And to try and fix this problem, I'm willing to bet you have tried using apps to add like those flashy Hormozy style captions and the little video effects to try and keep people's attention and to make your short form content more engaging. Or using AI tools that promise to find the most viral clips for you. And then they take your long form content, they give you 16 clips, and then you're sitting there like spending your time going through all of them, trying to pick the best one. And you post one and call it a day. Or maybe you've looked into hiring a video editor, but it's been out of budget. Or maybe you splurged and you hired that editor, that editing service, and you found that it just wasn't landing. The content just wasn't what you really expected. Not to mention that they wanted to upcharge you for every extra edit or extra cut that you asked them to make. Maybe you tried posting more frequently on social media. Like, okay, I just got to show up every day. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just have to get out there something. Let me just get some kind of content out there. Or maybe you post less frequently. You're like, this is not worth my time. What the heck? Like, this is not helping me grow my podcast at all. And maybe you've given up altogether on the short form content game. But the real reason that this problem is happening and the fact that your long form content repurposed is not engaging your audience on short form platforms is not because the podcast content isn't valuable, but it's because social media platforms want content that's uniquely created for that platform. Which is why straight up repurposing your podcast content, chopping it up and posting it everywhere is the least effective way to drive traffic back to your podcast. You know, someone said it this way once and I loved it. He said, you got to be a good platform citizen. Kind of like if you're an American, you can't expect just to go over to France and do American things, like you're going to get yelled at. And the same is true for social media platforms. And we know this, right? Deep down as hosts, we know this, but we don't want to admit it because, oh my gosh, it would be so much easier if we could just create one type of content and distribute it across all platforms and see engagement and see growth and have people excited to go listen to the podcast, and we could dust our hands off and call it a day. The good news is you can get there. Keep listening till the end of this episode, and I'll show you the strategy and what you need to be thinking about in order to get there. But it's going to require you to think differently about how you're planning your content. differently than you're thinking about it right now. That is, if you want that short form content to be effective and engaging. And I see this all the time. Podcast hosts who are well-intended, they want to drive traffic to their podcast. They've done the hard work of getting their show up and running. They're releasing episodes every week. They're giving away their best stuff for free in every episode. And so the first place they turn when they're like, okay, I want to grow the show, I need to build awareness about the show, they turn to social media, which is kind of ironic since most of them started their podcasts to be able to depend less on social media in the first place. But first and foremost, you got to realize that no amount of traffic that you drive to your podcast is going to matter if you don't have the foundational messaging and show positioning that you need to have in place first, which, fortunately for you, listening to my voice right now, we spend a lot of time here on this show and in our programs talking about to help you get in place. So a lot of times when existing podcasters come to us and they're like, my show's not growing, help me, what do I need to do? They're looking for strategies. They want to know how to grow the show. And I'm like, I could give you all the strategies in the world, but if you were to go out and apply any one of those right now, you would still be struggling to grow because there are cracks in the podcast foundation that we need to fix first, as far as your messaging and your positioning goes. Second to that, once you've got that foundation in place, then we have to know which sources of traffic are going to be best for your show. And the thing about this is that there's absolutely nothing extrinsic about figuring out which sources of traffic are best for you. It's all intrinsic. It all comes down to, number one, your personal bandwidth, your capacity. That's a big one. And a lot of times when it comes to podcast growth, we don't take this into account. And I've seen hosts go out there and they create separate social media channels for their podcast and they start posting to those channels. They start posting to their personal channels. They're posting all over the place. They're trying to grow the podcast and like nothing is happening. No change is happening. They burn out. They run out of bandwidth. They run out of capacity. Some of them quit altogether. So the first thing you got to consider to even know which sources of traffic are going to be best for your show is, what is my personal bandwidth in this season right now? Second to that, you got to consider, of all the platforms out there that are available to us at our fingertips with a touch of a button, which ones is your audience using? Because I guarantee you, your audience is not on every single platform. And I know that it can be tempting to want to go out and build a presence on all of these platforms because your intentions are good. Your intentions are to build your presence, increase your reach, get more visible, get more eyes on your message, and then drive traffic back to your podcast, and then wherever you want it to go from there, onto your email list and into your programs. But it's going to do you no good if you are spending your time and spinning your wheels posting on a platform that your audience isn't primarily using in the first place. And a lot of people forget this. So second to your bandwidth and your capacity, you got to think about, well, which platform is my audience actually using? And then third to that, you got to consider which platforms are you naturally drawn to? Which ones do you like to use? If you don't like Instagram and you don't want to be on Instagram, well, getting on Instagram just to post podcast content because you think you're missing out on some potential audience there is not going to work. People are going to be able to feel that that's not authentic. Why? Because it's oriented towards helping you versus helping them. And this is really important because this brings us to the 3 mental shifts that need to happen first before we can talk strategy for effective podcast content repurposing. If you want to be able to repurpose your podcast content and have people actually engage with it and enjoy it and want to go listen to the podcast episode, the first mental shift that you have to make, if you want to use social media to grow your podcast audience, has to be value first. We talked extensively about this in episode 226, and the same is true here. People are way too savvy these days to know if you're in it for you or if you're in it for them. They will pick up on it like that. The reason Alex Hormozy did so well when he first came on the scene with his short form content, he's had his podcast for years and years, but when he hit the scene with his short form content was because his intention, super important, his personal intention was to give value. Did he hope that his audience would grow? Yes. But that was second to providing value for his audience. His first goal wasn't let me grow to 1 million followers. It wasn't let me have a top 10 podcast. It wasn't let me make 8+ figures a year. Did all those things happen? Absolutely. But it was because he served his audience first. And I'm reminding you of this. I know we've all heard it before, but it's so easy to forget because we have our own personal goals for our business, for our podcast. I want to grow my podcast. I want to grow my business. That right there is a self-serving intention. It's a self-serving motivation. So the first mental shift is to become aware of that. And where are you creating content for your benefit? And work to shift that for your audience's benefit. That's number one. The second mental shift that you've got to make is adjusting your own expectations. I could come up with a plan tomorrow to say, okay, team, we're going to post 3 times a week on Instagram. We're going to start publishing articles to LinkedIn twice a week. And we're going to also start our YouTube channel. And we're going to post a podcast video edited, beautiful there once a week. Now, I can create that plan and I can have an expectation, even an unconscious expectation that maybe I'm not even fully aware of, that this is going to be the thing that's going to grow my following. And that in growing my following, I'm also going to see podcast growth. Well, guess what? When I start executing that plan, I'm going to be pretty darn disappointed 2 weeks into creating that content and posting that content without fail 3 times a week to Instagram, twice to LinkedIn, once to YouTube, on top of the podcast content I'm already creating. And I might see that I've lost followers or that my videos are getting a few views, but no one's commenting the keyword, to go to the workshop or whatever call to action I'm giving them. So again, we've got to align our expectations, adjust our expectations. Why are you posting on these platforms to begin with? Is it to serve you or serve others? The other thing you've got to remember is that if you're going to use social media as a means of driving traffic to your podcast, think about it. People on social media, they're not there to discover new podcasts. That's not even remotely on their radar. They're there to be entertained. They're there to connect. They're most likely there to distract. They're very rarely there to learn. And they're not even thinking, let me open my Instagram account to discover a new podcast to listen to. There's a disconnect there. So the way that learning happens on these platforms is through quick tips, not the deep content that we podcasters are so good at and love to talk about. So we have to remember, if we want to engage audiences on social media, we need to create for them and for the platform. And not just to expect that whatever we create is just going to work because we think it's good or because we said something really insightful in a podcast episode and we want people to hear it. I don't know if you listen to Connor Price's music. He is a rapper and he's got clean rap. So if you've got kids, it's a great option. In fact, my 6-year-old son loves some of his music. And he's a great example of this because as a music artist, what most music artists do is they're like, I've got this new song coming out. Hey, I'm going to drop a teaser for you. Look, I've got this brand new song just dropped today. Go listen, right? And we're all watching that cool, it engages nobody. So then Connor hit the scene. Connor, if you don't know him, he is an independent artist. He is not signed with a record label. He grew from 0 to over 1 billion streams independently. And the way he did it was engaging his audience on short form platforms to get them interested in his music. But if you go to Connor Price's profile with over 2.3 million followers just on Instagram alone, not a single video that he has ever posted is hey guys, new song, check it out. I'm awesome. Go listen. It's creative, funny, engaging, witty, and clever content that draws you in and introduces you to the song. In fact, I recommend go checking it out because this is how he grew so fast. But it was because he created the content for the platform and for his listeners, not for himself. But he got what he wanted because he put his listeners, his community first. So the last mental shift that has to happen before we can get into the practical strategy here is to recognize that chopping up your content and sharing it on every platform is not going to work. It's going to take more effort than that. And this is why I always say choose one platform to start. Because I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess you started a podcast to save yourself time, not to make more work for yourself. So your podcast should be your number one priority. It should always be your priority. In fact, we recommend to our clients for 6 months minimum, you should focus on mastering your podcast, getting your systems down, dialing in your workflow, mastering your craft as a podcast host. And after that, you're going to continue mastering your podcast craft for the lifetime of your podcast. But after you've dialed that in initially, then you can consider adding another platform. 2 at the very, very most. Unless you have a huge team and you've got someone who's actually managing that content across all the platforms for you, you're going to wind up spreading yourself too thin. And so your efforts and all that time and all that energy that you're putting into it is going to backfire. And if you watch me and you watch what I do, you're going to notice that my podcast is always the priority. I have never missed a single episode in over 4 years of podcasting. In no way do I say that to boast or to brag. I say that to show you how important it is to me to have an episode here for you every week. Now, on social media, I've taken many social media breaks during that time. In fact, I took a huge one just a few months ago for 3 months on end. But the podcast was still my number one focus. An episode still went out every week, sometimes twice a week on the show. So once you've got these mental priorities straight, okay, then we can talk about the 3 things that you need to think about when it comes to utilizing your podcast content, your long form content on short form platforms specifically. So the first step is something I call systematizing your episode planning process. Okay, in English, what that means is begin with the end in mind. If you know that you ultimately want to put your podcast video on YouTube, then first you have to know what things make a YouTube video successful. If you want to grow on YouTube, your video content is going to need to do those things. Now, look, I'm not a YouTube expert. I can't tell you what those things are, but there are certain things that YouTube is looking for that you will need to have in your content in order for that content to grow effectively on YouTube. If you just record your podcast and throw it up there on YouTube, there's a good chance you're going to be missing one or more of those elements and your video is not going to perform. But if you know what those things are, then you can incorporate them when you record your podcast episode. And so this allows you to shift from just creating your podcast to creating both for your podcast and for the other platform you want to post it on. This is also why I say start with one platform, because it makes it much easier to do this. And you can always add more as you go and as you grow. But most hosts do this backwards. They record the episode first, then they try to make it fit all the other platforms. And this is why they struggle. Highly effective social media content doesn't start when you post the clip to social media. It starts when you plan the episode. You want to plan your episode content so that it fits the platform you intend to share it on, not the other way around. You kind of have to reverse engineer this for each platform because each platform is different. So let's just imagine, for the sake of an example, that Instagram is your platform. And you know that you want at least one good clip out of every podcast episode that you create. So those clips need to have a strong hook. They need to keep the viewer watching. They need to say what needs to be said in less than 90 seconds because that's the limit on that platform. So knowing all of these things, you can then plug that into your podcast creation process. I will also add that those clips need to do 2 things. They need to add enough value to the viewer so that if they never click through to listen to your podcast, then they're still getting value. That's how you build an audience. And then number 2, it needs to create desire and demand to go listen to the full episode. So if you're teaching a 3-step process inside your episode, maybe that video clip is you giving 1 step that the viewers can use and get value from. But then if they want the rest, then they've got to go listen to the episode. And when you do this right, a portion of your social media audience is going to be more inclined to click through to listen. This is across the board for every single short form piece of content you create and repurpose from your long form content. And this is true across the board for every single platform. 4 years ago, when I started my podcast, the focus was the podcast. I'm still mastering the podcast, but I'm also now at a point where I can begin to think very strategically about the content that I create. And the 3 places where we want to be posting our content is Instagram, our email list, and LinkedIn. Email was the first one that we added in because I'm like, look, if I'm driving all this traffic from the podcast to our email list, we need something there to add value and to nurture those who are on our list. I've spent the last 6 months working on mastering that. And now that we've got that dialed in, I'm starting to work on updating our Instagram strategy. And once we dial that in, I'll move on to LinkedIn. And this brings me to step number 2 in the strategy, which is systematizing your editing process. The long form, chop it up into short form content part of this whole repurposing thing is usually what bogs most hosts down, especially if you are already editing your podcast yourself. It just creates way too much back-end work. And this is why most people will default to one of those AI tools out there that are promising 16 to 20 viral clips from every long-form podcast episode you upload. And a lot of hosts will spend their time, they look through it, they'll throw the clip up on social, and they'll leave it at that. And then they'll wonder why their social media isn't doing a thing to grow their podcast. But when you have strategically built your podcast episode to include the content that you need for whatever platform you're posting it on, guess what? That lifts the load of you having to go through to quote unquote find the best clips, because you already know what your best clips are. You can tell your video editor or your AI tool exactly what to cut and clip. And the added benefit of those clips is that they're going to be more likely to yield the result you're looking for because you created them for that platform, with that platform in mind. And this makes it so easy. If you are creating a short form clip for Instagram, well, you know that in your long form content, you're going to need a hook. It's going to need to be in 90 seconds, all those things we talked about. And you can just mark this in your notes. And depending on the style of video you're going for, you'll know when you get to that part in your notes, you can film during that part of the podcast for that clip. If it's face to camera, then you can look at the camera during those 90 seconds when you're recording that part of the episode. And again, all these little tweaks don't happen at the end of the episode or when you're ready to go and post it. They happen before you even hit record at the episode planning level. And then the third and final step is to begin to systematize your tracking process. So if podcast growth is your goal, it does us no good to just throw content out there without knowing if it's actually performing. And by performing, I mean giving you the results you're looking for in terms of driving people from social media back to your podcast. So at the very least, you want to be tracking engagement metrics for your podcast-based social media content. So the short form clips from your long form podcast content. You want to notice what performs well. Then examine why did it perform well and continue replicating that and rinse and repeat it. Another ninja move that you could make is to use a tool like ManyChat. There's a few of them out there that will integrate with platforms that have a DM feature like Instagram or Facebook. So instead of posting your podcast clip and then being like, oh, listen, at the link in my bio, you could say, if you want to listen to the full episode, comment below with the episode number and I'll DM you the link to the episode. Now you're feeding two birds with one hand. You are getting people engaged on the post itself. So you're actually creating that engagement, driving that engagement, which is what the platform wants to see, right? You know that Instagram's end goal is to keep people on the platform for as long as possible. And you are getting people to actually take an action that you can track to see how many people are asking for that link. It gives you a better gauge of how well your social media content is doing to drive traffic to the podcast. But again, the bottom line and the number one takeaway that I want you to take away from all of this is that none of this is going to work if the content itself isn't fit for the platform first. So if you plan on using social media to help increase awareness for your podcast, first you're going to have to shift your approach and reverse engineer your episode content, and then start embedding the social content into your episodes to make it easy to pull that content back out of it. And always, 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 always seek to serve your audience first and foremost on whatever platform without expecting immediate podcast growth from it. Because at the end of the day, I believe that you are the type of person who's here to create a movement. You're not just here to see a spike in the charts. And that is the ultimate long game play, which is what we podcasters do best. So stick around, because in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about 4 signs that listeners are overlooking your podcast. This goes back to the messaging piece that I was talking about earlier. And I'll show you what you can do to fix it. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.